something about clipping microphones onto my shirt that I never. Oh, there we go. So my official clicker here. So if we, anyway, thanks very much, David. And it's great to be here with the entire Hobbs family. And I'm especially pleased this is the second year Cynthia and I have had the opportunity to come to Elkhart Lake. We laughed last year about, I've been to racetracks all over the world, and I've never been to Elkhart Lake until last year. So we had a great time, and David was a wonderful tour guide, and we had a wonderful time driving around and looking at everything, and hopefully we can do that tomorrow and end the day having maybe a glass or two of white wine at Clive's house, sitting on the street watching cars go by. So, oh, and Mags. Of course, Mags. We love Mags. Mags is my buddy. Every Tuesday night, I sit next to Mags for dinner in Vero Beach. So many of you probably don't know who I am. So I start this by explaining to you just 10 seconds of my family history. Claire and Henry Ford only had one son, Edsel, and Edsel was at the, and I'll tell you more about when I get into the slideshow, because I think you'll find it very interesting. Edsel only lived with his parents for just a very short period of time, fell in love with a beautiful woman, and moved out to another part of Detroit. They had 4 children. Henry II, who was my father, Benson Ford, Josephine Ford, William Clay Ford, and of course, Bill Ford Jr. is William Clay Ford Sr.'s son. And then the sort of family came down from there. I was the oldest son of Henry Ford II, and there were 12 or 13 other grandchildren. And we're all involved in the company some way or another. And I was with several Ford dealers last night, and we were all sort of reminiscing about how their lives have been changed by the Ford franchise and being a Ford dealer, and how they really enjoy having members of the family as a part of the Ford Motor Company. So with that background, we'll go to the next slide. All right. Where's my? Okay. So what should I do? You'll follow along. It'll be easy to sort of move it. I apologize. There's quite a few slides here tonight, but I think you'll enjoy it because they're wonderful photographs, and it's a wonderful history of Claire and Henry Ford. Henry Ford shared his life on the farm with his parents, William and Mary, sisters Jane and Margaret, and brothers John, William, and Robert. On New Year's night in 1885, Henry attended a local dance with his family where his cousin introduced him to his bride-to-be, Clara Bryant. The couple married 2 years later on Clara's 22nd birthday. The newlyweds then settled into their home known as the Square House, which was built of lumber from trees harvested on Henry's Dearborn property. Henry Ford greatly admired one of America's most famous inventors, Thomas Edison. In 1891, Henry went to work as a mechanic engineer, earning $45 a month at Edison Illuminating Company in Detroit. This is the beginning of what would end up being a lifelong friendship. The closing months of 1893 were a busy time for Claire and Henry Ford. On November 6th, their first and only child, Edsel Bryant Ford, was born. In December, Henry was promoted to chief engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company and received a pay raise. He was now earning $100 a month. The Ford family then moved into a duplex at 58 Bagley Avenue, where on Christmas Eve, Henry successfully started and ran his first gasoline engine in Clara's kitchen. Now I'm going to pause for a moment because this is a really interesting story about, and yeah, that's good. Henry was very excited about the quadricycle and what it meant to lots of people. But he was a little concerned about the engine and how would the engine work. He had his engineers build the engine. He was so excited, he took it into the kitchen and he said to his wife, Clara, I want to show you how important this engine is going to be for my company. Now, she's in the middle of cooking Christmas dinner. And she said, Henry, this is, I'm not quite sure this is exactly right. I'm sort of making a little bit of this up, but I do believe most of it's true in the sense that Henry put the engine in the kitchen, in the sink, and with sort of gasoline of the time, started the engine up, and of course it smoked in the kitchen, and as you can imagine, Clara was not very happy with all of that. Anyway, from 1894 to 1896, Henry worked tirelessly in the shed behind the Ford duplex to design and develop a horseless carriage powered by the internal combustion engine that I just spoke about. On June 4th, 1896, he completed his first car, the quadricycle. On August 5th, 1899, Henry and his financial backers formed the Detroit Automobile Company. The Detroit Automobile Company's first and only vehicle was a delivery truck. The partners blamed Henry when the company went out of business because only 16 trucks were built. On October 10th, 1901, Henry made history when he and fellow racers Spider Huff, shown here on the running board of sweepstakes, took to the racetrack in Grosse Pointe, just outside of Detroit. And he beat Alexander Winton, the best driver of the time in America. Henry proudly displayed the trophy for years, but unfortunately, as we talked just the other day at the team at Fairlane, their home, the trophy is nowhere to be found. Although we've had a few people call up and say, we have the trophy. We keep on saying, we don't think you have the trophy. But anyway, we missed the trophy. With the 1901 victory, Henry's reputation continued to grow, and he launched his next automobile enterprise, Henry Ford Company. This, too, was short-lived, due in part to differences between the founding partners on the goals of the company and vehicle designs. Henry resigned from the company, and the company was reorganized as the Cadillac Automobile Company under the suggestion of Henry Leland. Henry's continuing success built his confidence and steadied his pursuit of building a successful automobile company. Meanwhile, he, Clara, and Edsel enjoyed family life, including visits to the family farm in what is now Dearborn, Michigan. The family enjoyed relaxing around Dearborn. A well-to-do businessman named Alexander Y. Malcolmson had been watching Henry's successful racing career. In 1903, he approached Henry, and with a group of 10 investors, they would form a new company. Henry would provide his automotive know-how, and they would provide the capital. Thus, on June 16th, at the age of 39 years old, Henry was the proud co-founder of the Ford Motor Company, owning 255 shares of the venture. In April of 1904, Ford Motor Company shareholders approved plans to expand capacity by purchasing some new property and building a new factory. Later that year, the company moved from the overcrowded Mack Avenue plant into the new Paquette Avenue plant. This new facility, 10 times the size of Mack Avenue, bolstered Henry's plans to assemble thousands of new vehicles. Even as the company expanded, Henry's dedication to hard work and continued growth remained constant. However, all work and no play was not what Clara wanted for her family, especially for Edsel during his childhood. Therefore, the family took vacations to Niagara Falls. Are we on? Yes, that's right. That's the slide. And Miami which Henry decided to document with his camera. By the fall of 1907, Henry became the largest stockholder of Ford Motor Company stock. He now had the deciding voice and the direction of his company. Henry now set sights on expanding the company and building a vehicle his employees could afford. Therefore, the company purchased more property in Highland Park, Michigan, for the site of a future manufacturing facility. Although 5 manufacturers declared bankruptcy, Ford Motor Company continued to succeed. By now, Henry's idea for a new vehicle was fully formed. On October 1st, 1908, Ford introduced the Model T, built and assembled at the Paquette Avenue plant. With the growing popularity of the Model T, Henry hired architect Albert Kahn to design a new plant at Highland Park, about 5 miles north of the Paquette facility. The factory was known as the Crystal Palace because of the extensive use of glass windows. It was the largest building under one roof in the state of Michigan. Clara and Henry had lived in numerous homes in Detroit by 1913. They decided to build a new home in Dearborn called Fairlane, close to their birthplace. They finally settled on a site 12 miles outside the center of Detroit on the banks of the scenic Rouge River. I'm not sure we would call the Rouge River scenic today, but maybe it was scenic back then. The location provided the couple with privacy they desired, along with proximity to nature. Excuse me. During their time at Fairlane, Clara cultivated gardens and music, and Henry explored engineering and agriculture. The next few years were exciting times for Henry and Ford Motor Company. The company continued to expand both domestically and overseas. The Model T continued to be a huge success. On October 7th, 1913, Ford was the first automobile company to introduce the integrated moving assembly line. It was an idea that revolutionized the automobile industry. As employment increased at Ford, many employees were unaccustomed to the repetitive work and long hours, and absentee grew to be high. The typical job at the time paid $2.50 for a 10-hour day. On January 5th, 1914, the Ford Motor Company announced it would pay workers $5 a day for an 8-hour shift. This high wage increased productivity, it reduced absenteeism, and attracted the best new hires. The company could now increase production by running 3 shifts a day. And we all believe that this really created the middle class in America. Henry's circles of friends included some of the very most famous individuals of the time, leaders of the day, including Harvey Firestone, Thomas Edison, and John Burroughs, the naturalist. The friendship between Burroughs and Ford began when Clara purchased a set of Burroughs' books on the philosophy of nature. Henry wrote and told him he disagreed with the belief that the automobile was going to disrupt nature. Henry was very health conscious. He avoided alcohol. He abhorred smoking, and he was known for eating soybeans. He was also very interested in the health of his employees and the communities where they lived. In 1912, ground was broken for the General Hospital of Detroit. The project faltered, and in September 1915, Clara and Henry stepped in and renamed it Henry Ford Hospital. It is said that this may have been their most important endeavor during their entire lives. In 1916, Henry established the Henry Ford Trade School in Highland Park to provide young people with technical education that would prepare them for jobs in industry. The curriculum included classes in shop practices, English, history, drafting, chemistry, physics, metallurgy, and bookkeeping. Upon graduation, many of the students who had worked in Ford plants during their training were offered jobs at Mr. Ford's company. More than 8,000 students graduated from the school, which closed in 1952. Eleanor Clay and Edsel Ford were married on November 1, 1916. Less than a year later, on September 4th, 1917, they became the proud parents of a baby boy, Henry Ford II, my father, the first of 4 children. Grandparents Claire and Henry enjoyed spending time with their children, and it's no surprise that Henry's namesake received a lot of grandfatherly attention. And after several conversations with my dad over the years, I can tell you how much my father and his brother Benson and Josephine, the sister, and William Kay loved coming to see Claire and Henry. It was like going to Disney. And if they got bored, they could go over to the Rouge plant and drive whatever they wanted. So their impressions of their grandfather was just, or grandparents, I should say, was really sensational. In 1918, Henry Ford went on the first of several camping trips with John Burroughs, Thomas Edison, and Harvey Firestone. This group of close friends and campers were known as the Vagabonds. It was the first glamping trip of its kind. Henry Ford's ultimate goal was to achieve total self-sufficiency by owning, operating, and coordinating all the resources needed to produce his automobiles. His development of the Rouge factory complex embodied his version of vertical integration. In 1919, Henry spearheaded the release of a revolutionary policy statement that established Ford Motor Company as a leader and an advocate for equality and equal opportunity. And it read, I quote, "We have learned to appreciate men as men and to forget the discrimination of color, race, country, religion, fraternal orders, and everything outside of humane qualities and energy." Mind you, that was written in 1919. In the early 1920s, Lincoln Motor Company, owned by Henry Leland and his son Wilfred, located in Detroit, was in financial trouble. At the urging of Clara, Henry's wife, and Edsel, the Lelands approached Henry about purchasing Lincoln. A deal was struck, and on February 4th, 1922, Lincoln was sold for $8 million. Edsel's vision for the Lincoln brands was, and I quote, "Father made the most popular car in the world. I would like to make the best car in the world." Henry's plan for vertical integration also included owning the transportation system to deliver raw materials and supplies to the Rouge complex. In 1924, the company launched 2 iron ore freighters, the Henry Ford II and the Benson Ford. Both ships were a familiar sight as they traveled the Great Lakes, carrying coal and iron ore for 65 years until they were finally decommissioned. On June 4th, 1924, Ford Motor Company achieved a milestone with its 10 millionth car built. This was an accomplishment that Henry never thought he could accomplish. This milestone car was greeted by a large, enthusiastic crowd as it traveled the Lincoln Highway on a cross-country tour. In 1925, after living in Detroit for 9 years, Eleanor and Edsel Ford decided to build a brand new home on 87 acres of lakefront property in Grosse Pointe, purchased from Henry. Eleanor and Edsel built a beautiful Cotswold-style mansion where they raised their 4 children, and it is now open to the public. So for those of you who come across the lake to our side, I hope that you might take an opportunity to go and visit the Edsel and Eleanor Ford house in St. Clair Shores. It is absolutely sensational. It's a beautiful home, fully restored. When my grandmother died, she literally left it the way it was. So and it's been beautifully maintained. And so I would highly recommend that if you come over, not only go to the Edsel and Eleanor Ford house, but go to the Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village. I mean, there's so much to do on our side of the lake. Claire and Henry grew tired of their winter home in Fort Myers, Florida. The climate was too hot, it was too humid, and there was little privacy. Their choice for a new home was a site near Savannah, Georgia. Over the next 10 years, they purchased more than 75,000 acres just outside of Savannah. It wasn't until 1935 they decided just where on the property they would build a home. But once construction began, all types of buildings were erected, including community homes, a sawmill, an ice plant, a trade school, fire stations, a health clinic, bakery, the George Washington Carver School, and maybe most importantly, to Claire and Henry, their new home. The sprawling estate was to be known as Richmond Hill. Henry and Edsel developed Ford Air Transportation with the same enthusiasm they had for their automotive ventures. Edsel was especially interested in this new form of mobility. Together, father and son started building the Ford Airport, with the first concrete runway in the United States and a passenger terminal with bus service to Detroit. Meanwhile, William Stout and Edsel were designing the famous tri-motor airplane. Soon, airmail was added. Other aviation firsts included radio-controlled navigations, experimental aircraft, and an airport hotel called the Dearborn Inn. I will pause 1 minute and tell you a very cute story that always comes to mind when I talk about the tri-motor. All of you know about Oshkosh, and I used to go to Oshkosh almost every year. And one year, someone came up to me and said, "There's a woman who would like to meet you." And it was right near a Ford tri-motor that was on display. So I went over and I met the woman, and she was one of the first flight attendants on a tri-motor. And I said, "You have to tell me what it was like." She said, "We used to leave Detroit to go to California. It would take forever because they couldn't fly at night. So they would go from city to city during the daytime. Passengers would check into a hotel and then they'd leave the next day." And she said it was just amazing. She said we had full food service. There was a bathroom on the airplane. I think it only sat 12 people, and she just was a remarkable woman with an incredible story. It just reminded me of what it must have been like back in those days when travel was not as sort of as sophisticated as it is today. Anyway, a nice story. Henry took delight in his grandchildren, as I said. He told them stories and showed them how he farmed when he was a boy. Most of all, spending time with his grandchildren allowed him to escape from the never-ending stress of running the Ford Motor Company. When Henry was in his mid-60s, he took on a new challenge, developing an all-new car to replace the Model T. Millions were eager to see what the next Ford car would be. Across the nation and around the globe, people wondered, can Henry really make a comeback? The stakes were high. Henry showed no signs of anxiety. Henry and Edsel worked together on his vehicle size, design, its features. It would be manufactured and assembled at the Rouge Complex, and the result was the 1928 Ford Model A, named in commemoration of the original 1903 Model A. On September 27, 1928, Henry Ford started a new project, which he called the Edison Institute. Today it is known as the Henry Ford, which houses the Henry Ford Museum and Greenfield Village. He described this endeavor by saying, "I am collecting the history of our people as written into things their hands made and used. When we are through, we shall have reproduced American life as lived." And that, I think, is the best way of preserving at least a part of our history and tradition. Henry honored his friend and hero, Thomas Edison, by painstakingly moved the original Menlo Park laboratory to the Henry Ford, to Greenfield Village. Although he was in his 80s and frail, Thomas Edison was present at the opening ceremony and recreated his famous lighting of the incandescent light bulb, symbolizing a moment of invention. Henry Ford called it one of the proudest days of his life. In mid-1937, Chrysler and General Motors had unionized, and Ford would not give in. Harry Bennett, who led Ford Motor Company's security department, assembled a variety of tough servicemen to keep the unions out of Ford. On the UAW side, Walter Reuther, a former Ford employee, organized sit-down strikes to force the company to accept a union contract. On May 26, 1937, the famous Battle of the Overpass occurred, which stands today as a pivotal event in the history of the U.S. labor movement. Edsel had a customized Lincoln Zephyr convertible coupe designed, built, and shipped to him in Palm Beach, Florida on March 1st, 1939. He drove the car around Palm Beach and showed it to many of his acquaintances. He returned to Detroit a few months later, only to find dozens of people had placed orders for the car, and that's how the famous Lincoln Continental was born. In 1940, Ford Motor Company was trying to be responsive to the American government's war effort. First, the government asked Ford to make Rolls-Royce airplane engines for the war effort in England. Henry canceled the order, stating the company would only make them if the U.S. was at war. Additionally, Edsel was working with the War Department on the development of a Ford Willys Jeep. Many of you probably don't know that Ford Motor Company actually built a Jeep based off of Willys vehicle. And I was on, I'm sure some of you have heard of Bring a Trailer. I'm a big fan of Bring a Trailer. I'm on the site constantly looking for interesting vehicles to purchase. And this Ford Jeep came up. And at about $30,000 I stopped. I thought that was probably too much for me. Anyway, it was pretty neat. The paperwork said it was an original Ford Jeep. Fun. By the spring of 1941, the war in Europe was raging. Ford workers in America were receiving slightly less pay than their unionized counterparts working for General Motors and Chrysler. On April 1, 1941, workers held a massive strike at the Ford Rouge facility. More than 50,000 people gathered in support of the union. Tensions grew over the next 2 days, and ultimately, Clara and Edsel convinced Henry to allow Ford employees to join the UAW. Edsel spearheaded building the building of the Willow Run plant, which was commissioned to solely build B-24 Liberator bombers. By the time the U.S. declared war, Ford Motor Company was already training thousands of needed personnel. It was completing the huge Willow Run complex and turning out B-24 bombers. At peak production, the plant turned out one B-24 bomber an hour, with more than 18,000 B-24 bombers produced by the end of the war. Eleanor and Edsel were adamant about their children that they would get good educations. Henry, though virtually self-taught, agreed, and all his grandchildren went to the best schools. My dad went to Yale, Benson went to Princeton, Josephine attended Chatham Hall, and William Clay also went to Yale. Their education also continued on the job. Edsel made sure that Henry II and Benson were exposed to Ford Motor Company, and both of them worked at the Ford Engineering Center in Dearborn. At 1:10 a.m. on May 26, 1942, Edsel died of stomach cancer at his home. He was only 49 years old. Clara and Henry were never the same afterward. They felt the stress of running Ford Motor Company had killed their only child. Edsel had worked alongside his father through every phase of Ford Motor Company. As the flag flew at half-mast over the company's administration building, a drama began to unfold as people wondered who would fill Edsel's shoes and the new vacant office of the president of Ford Motor Company. Ford Motor Company marched on. With the passing of Edsel Ford, the company successfully petitioned the government to release my father, Henry Ford II, from the Navy to help run the Willow Run plant. He was made a company vice president on December 15, 1943, and on September 20th, 1945, a momentous event occurred. At the urging of Clara and Eleanor, 82-year-old Henry resigned and handed the reins over to his 28-year-old grandson, Henry II. This marked the end of an era of an American legend. Henry's lifestyle changed with his departure from Ford. He began to attend special functions. He continued to serve as a trustee on several boards and made daily visits to his beloved museum in Greenfield Village to talk with young students about their life and their careers. During Henry Ford's later years, Clara remained a loyal and supportive partner, traveling with him, engaging in philanthropy and advocating for women's causes, while also managing their estate fairly and pursuing her interests in gardening and horticulture. Henry once said, "I attribute whatever I may have been able to accomplish in life far more to my wife than to anything else and to everything else put together. But I cannot flatter myself that I found her because I was a good picker. I believe profoundly that we are guided, led in such momentous matters." He was quoted in Forbes magazine in 1940. On April 6, 1947, Clara and Henry returned to Fairlane from their wonderful, beautiful winter retreat, Richmond Hill. It had rained in Dearborn for several days, and the Rouge River had overflowed its banks. Fairlane's hydroelectric powerhouse flooded, and by the next morning, both the electricity and steam heat were out. Henry's chauffeur drove him around the area to assess the damage. At the end of the day, Henry went to his cemetery, or the cemetery, where his mother and father were buried. He returned home and went to bed early. During the night, he became ill, and Clara summoned their housekeeper. And around midnight on April 7th, 1947, Henry Ford passed away from a cerebral hemorrhage in his bedroom, lit by candlelight, heated by a fireplace, just the same way he had come into the world. The working man's hero had passed, and the world took notice. More than 100,000 people waited for hours in poor weather and rain to pay their respects to this great man. Tribute letters were sent from Harry Truman, Winston Churchill, and even Joseph Stalin. Henry Ford achieved what others can only dream of achieving. He and Clara were married for nearly 59 years. She lived another 3 after his passing. Henry also had the satisfaction and pride of partnering with and working with his son Edsel. He was awarded honorary doctorate degrees from several universities and countless citations and honors from many professional organizations. Even a U.S. stamp was issued in 1968 to commemorate Henry Ford. And in 1999, Fortune magazine named Henry Ford Businessman of the Century. Thank you very much.